The Munich Agreement of 1938 became one of the most cited examples of a flawed policy of appeasement. In the late 1930s, Germany increased pressure on Czechoslovakia, demanding the transfer of the Sudetenland, a strategically important region with developed industry and fortified defense lines. Despite the obvious nature of the claims, the leaders of Great Britain and France sought to avoid a military clash and were ready to make concessions. Representatives of four countries gathered at the conference in Munich: Germany, Italy, Great Britain, and France. Czechoslovakia, whose territorial interests were being discussed, was not admitted to the negotiations, which in itself demonstrated the political weakness of the self-proclaimed European guarantors of its security. Neville Chamberlain, the head of the British government, believed that agreeing to Hitler's demands would prevent war. The signed document transferred the Sudetenland to Germany, effectively destroying the defense structure of Czechoslovakia. The key mistake lay in an incorrect assessment of Germany's intentions. Chamberlain proceeded from the assumption that Hitler sought only to restore justice and would not move further. Reality showed the opposite. As early as the spring of 1939, Germany completely occupied Czechoslovakia, thereby demonstrating that the Munich Agreement was perceived as a green light for further aggression. The loss of strategic territories, industrial base, and international support made Czechoslovakia incapable of resistance. For European diplomacy, Munich became an important lesson. It showed that concessions to authoritarian regimes do not stabilize the situation, but rather form an expectation of impunity. The policy of appeasement led to Germany strengthening its positions, increasing the potential of its army, and gaining confidence that the Western powers were not ready for decisive action. The result was a direct path to the Second World War. Trojan Horse. The story of the fall of Troy is one of the most famous examples of how an incorrect assessment of a threat can lead to disaster. According to ancient sources, after 10 years of siege, the Greeks abandoned a direct assault and shifted to a psychological strategy. They built a large wooden structure in the shape of a horse and staged a retreat, leaving the gift at the city gates. Nothing threatening was visible on the surface of the horse, but inside there was a squad of armed elite warriors. The reaction of the Trojans became a key factor. There was no unity in the city. Part of the population considered the structure a trap. Others perceived it as a symbol of victory. The priest Laocoon, who warned of the possible danger, was not heard. Moreover, the legend of his death by sea monsters sent by the gods was interpreted as a sign that the horse should indeed be brought into the city. As a result, the decision was made on an emotional basis without proper risk analysis. The structure ended up inside the fortress walls, which completely changed the balance of power. At night, when the city fell asleep, the warriors hidden inside opened a hatch and let in the Greek army, which had returned in advance under the cover of darkness. In conditions of surprise and a lack of coordination, the defense of Troy was effectively paralyzed. Archaeological data indicates that the city did indeed experience destruction around the 13th century BC, which coincides with the period where ancient tradition places the Trojan War. Although the actual wooden horse may be an artistic symbol or metaphor, the very essence of the mistake remains relevant. Underestimating the enemy, the lack of a unified command decision, and ignoring warnings led to the defense collapsing not under the onslaught of an army, but due to a miscalculation in decision-making. The Trojan horse became a historical example of how properly organized camouflage and psychological pressure can turn a defensive advantage into a fatal flaw. The execution of Jesus. The events surrounding the condemnation of Jesus Christ have immense religious significance, but their political context is often underestimated. The Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate, found himself in a situation where any decision threatened consequences. His task was to maintain order in a province regularly engulfed by social unrest. The appearance of a charismatic preacher, followed by crowds, caused alarm among the local elite. The Jewish Sanhedrin demanded execution, But from the perspective of the Roman administration, Jesus did not pose a clear threat. Pilate tried to avoid a radical decision. According to sources, he repeatedly offered to release Jesus as a harmless criminal or replace the punishment with a less severe one. But pressure was put on him. Religious leaders and part of the crowd argued that the preacher was undermining order and that a refusal to meet their demands would be regarded as a manifestation of the authorities' weakness. In the conditions of an unstable province, this could lead to riots, which Pilate sought to avoid at all costs. The mistake was that the governor underestimated the long-term consequences of his decision. He chose an option that allowed him to keep the situation under control here and now, but failed to consider that the execution could turn the accused into a symbol. An action aimed at preventing a local conflict spawned a movement that spread throughout the entire empire. Within just a few decades, Christianity became a prominent force, and by the 4th century, it had turned into the state religion of Rome. Historians note that Pilate had alternatives. He could have overturned the sentence, delayed the decision, or transferred the case to Rome, where the prospects of execution were less likely. However, the desire to avoid responsibility and quickly relieve tension led to the most resonant outcome. Pilate himself was later recalled from Judea. His policies were considered unsuccessful. But the main consequence was that his decision became one of the central events of world history, defining the cultural and social development of a vast number of countries. The telegram that changed the world. The July crisis of 1914 is a classic example of how a chain of misinterpretations and communication delays can lead to a global conflict. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary was preparing a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. However, the exact content of the document was kept secret, and European powers received only fragmentary information. A key role was played by an incident later dubbed by the press as the Lost Telegram. Russian and French diplomats learned about the real conditions of the ultimatum too late to influence the situation. Austria-Hungary sent Serbia demands that practically guaranteed a refusal. But the Entente countries, lacking exact information, were confident that it was a matter of standard diplomatic claims. As a result, they underestimated the scale of the threat and made no attempts to involve mediators in the negotiations in time. Even within the German leadership, there were disagreements. Kaiser Wilhelm II considered the terms of the ultimatum to be unjustifiably harsh, but he received its content when the telegram arrived with a delay, already after Austria-Hungary had begun mobilization. The mistake lay in the fact that diplomatic channels did not ensure the timely transmission of information, and governments drew conclusions based on assumptions. When the exact data became known, the crisis had moved to a stage where political maneuvering was impossible. Serbia accepted almost all the demands, except for the point about admitting Austrian investigators. But this no longer mattered. Austria-Hungary declared war on it, which activated the system of alliances, dragging the whole of Europe into the conflict. Historians emphasize that in the absence of a timely exchange of data, the leaders of the countries overestimated their own positions and underestimated the risks. If the content of the ultimatum had been known in advance, it might have been possible to initiate an international conference similar to the one that resolved the crisis of 1908. But in 1914, a communication error became one of the catalysts for a world war. This episode shows how dangerous diplomatic gaps can be in conditions of high tension. Chernobyl. The accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on April 26, 1986, was the result of a combination of the design features of the RBMK 1000 reactor, regulatory violations, and erroneous actions by the personnel. A key moment was the experiment that was conducted during the night shift at the 4th Power Unit. Its purpose was to test the ability of the turbo generator to provide power to the pumps in the event of a loss of external power supply. However, in preparation for the test, the operators brought the reactor into an unstable mode, violating safety requirements. One of the factors was the accumulated number of absorbing rods in the upper part of the active zone. which increased reactivity when the emergency protection was lowered. The personnel underestimated the danger, believing that the control system would be able to contain the reactor. When the power unexpectedly began to rise, the operators activated the emergency shutdown, the AZ-5 system. But a design feature of the RBMK, in which the graphite tips of the rods briefly increased reactivity at the moment of lowering, led to a sharp surge in power. In a fraction of a second, the reactor became uncontrollable. As a result, a thermal explosion occurred, destroying the roof of the reactor and throwing graphite and radioactive materials outside. Management decisions in the first hours after the accident also aggravated the situation. The scale of the leak was hidden, and the evacuation of Pripyat was carried out only more than 36 hours later. International specialists note that an important part of the problem was the safety culture in the USSR, where emergency signals were often ignored, and the discussion of potential risks was not encouraged. Individual errors in design, personnel training, and the execution of the experiment might not have led to a disaster individually, but their combination created a situation where any non-standard reaction could become critical. Chernobyl became an example of how a combination of technical flaws and uncoordinated actions can lead to an accident, the consequences of which are felt for decades. After the incident, safety standards at nuclear power plants were revised in many countries, and the accident itself became one of the key arguments in the discussion of the risks of nuclear energy. Columbus's mistake. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 became an example of how erroneous mathematical calculations can lead to results completely different from the original intent. Columbus sought to find a western sea route to Asia, believing that the distance between Europe and East Asia was significantly less than considered by scholars of that time. The basis of his calculations was the data of the Persian scholar al-Farghani, but Columbus incorrectly interpreted the units of measurement, underestimating the Earth's circumference by about a quarter. While most geographers and cartographers understood that the route across the Atlantic was too far for existing ships, Columbus was confident that Japan and China were located just a few thousand kilometers from Spain. The Spanish crown approved the expedition, anticipating potential trade benefits, but the actual route turned out to be much longer than Columbus had assumed. Nevertheless, the journey brought him to the shores of the Bahamas, a territory unknown to Europeans. Columbus's mistake was also his further assertion that he had reached the eastern lands. Even after the discovery of Cuba and Haiti, he continued to interpret them as the outskirts of Asia. This led to a distorted perception of the geography of the New World for several decades. Moreover, his incorrect conclusions determined the direction of subsequent expeditions, which sought Asian riches where they did not exist. However, the consequences of the mistake turned out to be massive. Columbus's expedition led to the beginning of the European colonization of the Americas, the restructuring of trade routes, mass migration of the population, and the formation of new political systems. From a scientific point of view, the voyage confirmed the possibility of long ocean crossings and stimulated cartographic research. Historians note that if Columbus's calculations had been accurate, the expedition most likely would not have received funding. Sailing to Asia would have been unattainable for 15th century technology. Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, is considered one of the greatest strategic mistakes of the leadership of the Third Reich. Hitler was confident that the Soviet Union would fall within a few months. These expectations were based on an overestimated assessment of the capabilities of the German army and on a profound misunderstanding of the economic and human potential of the USSR. The German command assumed that the Red Army would be destroyed in border battles, and further resistance would turn out to be minimal. The model of the campaign was built on the idea of a lightning war. However, the initial calculations proved to be erroneous. German troops did indeed achieve major encirclements, Vyazma, Kyiv, Smolensk, but the scale of Soviet mobilization was underestimated. Germany assumed that the USSR had limited resources, whereas in reality, the country possessed a deeply echeloned industrial base, part of which could be evacuated beyond the Urals. The German command did not expect that the USSR would be able to deploy the production of tanks and aircraft in wartime conditions in such volumes. A significant miscalculation was also the division of forces between several directions. Instead of focusing on the capture of Moscow, Hitler redirected part of the army to the south to seize Ukrainian resources. This decision pushed back the time frame for the offensive on Moscow to the autumn, when weather conditions became critical. The rains led to the Rasputitsa mud season, and then suddenly frost set in, for which German equipment and supplies were not prepared. Winter equipment for the troops had not been prepared. The command assured that the campaign would end before the cold weather. An additional factor was Hitler's ideological attitude towards the population of the USSR. He proceeded from the assumption that the local residents would greet the German troops as liberators. In practice, the occupation policy, which included repressions and violence, led to the opposite effect. Resistance intensified, and partisan movements began to play a prominent role. Ultimately, Operation Barbarossa not only failed the task of a swift defeat of the USSR, but also dragged Germany into a two-front war, a strategic situation that the German military themselves considered unacceptable. The miscalculation in assessing the geopolitical, logistical, and human components of the war became one of the key reasons for the defeat of the Third Reich. The Great Depression. The U.S. stock market crash on October 29, 1929, became the visible starting point of the Great Depression, but its causes had been forming long before that. One of the key mistakes was the policy of credit stimulation, which allowed the public and investors to massively buy stocks on credit. Banks willingly issued loans secured by securities, which created the illusion of sustainable growth. In practice, the market turned out to be artificially inflated. The value of shares of large companies significantly exceeded their actual profitability. An additional factor was the inefficiency of regulation. In the late 1920s, stock exchange operations were practically not controlled by the state, which allowed brokers to manipulate prices and create speculative bubbles. When the market began to lose its stability, investors sold stocks en masse in an effort to save their funds. The fall, in quotes, was rapid. Billions of dollars disappeared from the market in a matter of days. Mistakes continued even after the crash. The Federal Reserve System, instead of expanding the money supply and preventing bank bankruptcies, tightened credit policy. This led to banking institutions beginning to close one after another, and the population lost access to their funds. A wave of panic intensified the downturn. People withdrew their savings, companies laid off workers, and production shrank rapidly. International trade also took a hit. The U.S. introduced the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raised duties on imported goods. It was intended to protect the domestic market, but other countries responded with mirror measures. The volume of world trade shrank by almost half, which deepened the crisis even further. Over the course of a few years, unemployment in the U.S. reached 25%, and in a number of European countries, over 30%. Economists believe that a combination of mistakes, from overestimating stock market growth to incorrect monetary policy, turned an ordinary downturn into a global economic shock. Only in the mid-1930s did an understanding of the need for systemic state intervention begin to form. Franklin Roosevelt's programs, united under the name New Deal, became an attempt to correct the mistakes of previous policies, stabilize the banking system, and create mechanisms to protect the population. Titanic. The sinking of the Titanic on April 14, 1912, was a combination of engineering miscalculations, organizational errors, and incorrect management decisions. The vessel was positioned as the pinnacle of early 20th century maritime technology, and it was precisely the confidence in its unsinkability that played a key role in the tragedy. The ship's design indeed included a system of watertight compartments, however. Their height did not allow them to contain large scale flooding. This was later acknowledged by engineers who analyzed the hull's schematics. A few hours before the collision, the Titanic's radio station received messages from other ships about drifting icebergs. Some of them were passed to the captain, but did not receive proper attention. The ship was traveling at high speed, striving to set a route crossing record. Moreover, due to the large number of private telegrams sent by passengers, some of the warnings were processed with a delay. The radio room operator had to prioritize commercial messages. At the moment of the collision, helmsman Hitchens was performing an evasive maneuver. However, researchers later noted that the navigation requirements of that time practically did not take into account the reaction of huge liners to such maneuvers. The forward part of the ship received a series of hull breaches below the waterline, which led to the flooding of 5 compartments at once. The crew was not prepared for such a scenario. Evacuation drills were not conducted, and the number of lifeboats was calculated for minimum standards, not for the actual number of people on board. Errors continued after the impact. The distress message was not sent immediately, and the nearby ship Californian did not receive the signals because its radio operator had already finished work for the night. The lack of around-the-clock watch became a critical factor. At the same time, the liner Carpathia received the signal, but was too far away to prevent mass casualties. The investigation established that a combination of organizational overconfidence, lack of preparedness for emergency situations, and the ignoring of external warnings became the key cause of the ship's loss. The accident led to a global reform of maritime safety rules, including mandatory 24-hour radio duty, an increase in the number of life-saving equipment, and international control over icebergs in the North Atlantic. The Titanic became an example of how faith in technological superiority can lead to an underestimation of real threats. The burning of the Library of Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria was one of the largest centers of knowledge in the ancient world. According to historical data, its collections numbered hundreds of thousands of scrolls covering mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and geography. However, its destruction was the result of not one, but several mistakes related to political conflicts, military actions, and religious confrontations. The loss of the library is often viewed as a symbol of how vulnerable scientific achievements are in the face of instability. The first major damage, according to some historians, occurred during the Roman Civil War in 48 BC, when Julius Caesar's troops set fire to the ships in the port of Alexandria. The flames spread to the city's warehouses, potentially affecting the scroll repositories as well. The exact extent of the destruction remains a subject of debate, but many ancient authors point to significant losses. The mistake lay in underestimating the risks associated with the use of fire in a densely built-up area where archives and repositories of knowledge were located. The next stage of destruction is associated with the conflicts of the 3rd to 4th centuries AD, when the Christian and pagan communities fought for influence in the city. The Temple of Serapis, which included the daughter library, was destroyed in 391 by the order of Emperor Theodosius I. This decision reflected the political struggle for control over the cultural space, but led to the loss of unique works by ancient authors. The managerial mistake consisted in the fact that the authorities failed to ensure the preservation of the scientific heritage, viewing the library as an ideological object. The final disappearance of the library could have occurred in the 7th century, during the conquest of Alexandria by Arab forces. Although the degree of destruction during this period is also debated, historical tradition speaks of the systematic destruction of scrolls that were considered unnecessary for the new administration. Modern researchers agree that the main cause of the library's disappearance was not a single catastrophe, but a combination of political instability, the lack of centralized protection of cultural objects, and the strategic miscalculations of the authorities. The loss of the Library of Alexandria became one of the greatest cultural losses of antiquity, and an example of how management errors lead to the disappearance of knowledge accumulated by generations. History shows that key turning points in the fate of civilizations are often linked not to grand plans or brilliant ideas, but to mistakes, sometimes obvious, sometimes barely noticeable at first glance. Decisions made under the pressure of circumstances, in conditions of information scarcity, or due to incorrect risk assessment, are capable of changing political systems, destroying cities, launching wars, and shaping new eras. And the more massive human influence becomes, the more consequences miscalculations in management, science, and diplomacy can have. Thank you very much for watching. I am incredibly grateful for your reactions under my videos. It is you who help promote my videos and make the production of new videos much higher quality. We are not saying goodbye. See you in the next video.